So our idea really, when we started thinking about this, was that there's these concurrent pressures which might lead to a health paradox. So one in which the increased emphasis on children's health behaviors and the role of parents in children's health means that children's interests might be seen to be taking front seat to parental interests, and as a consequence, parents are spending more time raising their children and more energy. So this could be seen to have positive effects, which is shown in the literature for having a positive effect, for example, on children's physical health. But the literature is not very clear on whether or not this increased time spent raising children has positive effects on children's psychological well-being. And in fact, some of the research from Schiffrin and others, and from Jan and others, suggests that this effect of parental involvement is actually an inverted U-shape. So it might be positive for a while, but at some point becomes negative, or the other way around, rather, that highly involved parents, the children show higher levels of internalizing problems like anxiety and depression, and then higher levels of externalizing problems when they reach adolescence. As they then become college age, they again show higher levels of anxiety and lower levels of coping skills. But that's with the focus on children, and we were actually thinking that there's two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, you can see the effects on children. On the other hand, the increased focus on children can negatively impact parents. And at least from a work-family balance perspective, there's not a lot of discussion on that going on, because it can lead to increased feelings of time pressure, particularly among mothers, and as well as reduced psychological well-being. So our initial idea was to try and look at these concurrently. So the paradox of, is it positive for children but maybe negative for parents? But as it happens with initial ideas, this was really a bit too complex to deal with in one paper. So we've been trying to split this out, and the paper that I'm presenting today is the first step in that, looking at a possible paradox just for children's health, specifically in relation to intensive parenting. So to come to some conclusions, which was hard in this type of an exploratory paper, I think, we find that the intensity of parenting activities does differ in significant ways as children age. So it's suggesting to us that it can be useful to distinguish not only intensive parenting on its own, but also some other styles of parenting. But how we do this is, I think, a matter for discussion. The parenting categories that we've differentiated here are significantly related to children's physical health outcomes to some extent and to well-being, but less so to children's self-esteem outcomes. And the extent to which parenting matters differs depending upon the activities and the developmental stage at which we're looking at, which suggests that this longitudinal perspective can be quite important there. For example, at the ages of 3 and 5, the activities undertaken better predict general health outcomes than the other styles of parenting, the intermediate and neglectful ones. But at age 7, the only significant differences are found between neglectful parenting and intensive parenting. So there's some interesting things going on there. It also suggests, in terms of our findings, that it's necessary to differentiate between these styles of parenting and the effects on children's physical and psychological health. So we would really argue that, at least in the discourse, where it's just about children's health in general, we need to be distinguishing whether we're talking about physical or psychological health. And the findings on psychological health are really quite ambiguous. So intensive parenting activities does seem to predict better well-being for children later in life at the age of 14, but only the activities taken on from when children are at the age of 5 onwards. And differences between the intermediate activities of parenting and that intensive parenting are marginal, even non-existent. And in regards to self-esteem, the intensive parenting activities only seem to affect the self-esteem of children later in life at wave 3, again when children are 5. And surprisingly, and I guess going against general conceptions of parenting, we don't necessarily find differences between intensive and neglectful parenting, but we also find very little evidence that there's significant differences between intermediate and intensive parenting. And so Mara was thinking about this. She said, well, you know, the scientific evidence would suggest that the effects of parenting usually focus on how neglectful parenting activities might affect children's health outcomes, and they're not necessarily looking at this kind of intermediate thing. And she noted a study by De Clementi et al. That suggests that a lack of parental monitoring in terms of unhealthy sexual behavior, that a lack of parental monitoring can lead to that. But while parental monitoring might improve sexual health outcomes, it doesn't mean that the more intensely that you do it, the better those outcomes become. So in other words, with parenting activities, there might be kind of a happy medium, that being a good enough parent is good enough, and intensely doing those activities doesn't necessarily improve the outcomes of children even more. And in fact, it might even lead to then negative outcomes for children's psychological well-being.